Welcome to Come Follow Me, a doctrinal and historical context for Doctrine and Covenants 102 to 105. You can see from this particular graph that we're dealing with the first half of 1834, and that all of these sections were revealed in Kirkland, except for 105, the last section, which was given as Joseph Smith led Zion's camp to Jackson County, Missouri. And as they paused to understand the will of the Lord, they received that section. Before we get into it too deeply, I just want to put a plug in for the Saints, which we talked about a little bit last week, which is the new historical, I'm going to call it a novel. It's not really a novel, but it's kind of written like a novel that deals with the stories of the restoration. In particular, this week, if you look at chapters 18 and 19, that covers the same basic material that we're going to cover in our sections. So let's jump in, first of all, with section 102. By early 1834, the church had grown to over 3,000 members. This growth created a need for additional leadership. And on February the 17th, 24 high priests gathered in Joseph Smith's home for a conference in which the first high council of the church was organized. The clerk of the meeting, Orson Hyde, noted that there may have been some errors in the minutes of the meeting. Therefore, the council voted that the prophet should take a look at them and make any corrections. So he spent the next day making an inspired revision of the minutes. These minutes were amended and accepted. Now they're found in Doctrine and Covenants, section 102. So you can see that the Doctrine and Covenants was not just direct revelations. Sometimes it was like something here where they were minutes of notes. So these minutes outlined the establishment of high councils and provided direction for stake presidencies as they administered discipline for people who may have committed serious sin. From the minute book in Joseph Smith papers, we read the following. Joseph Smith took responsibility for some of the shortcomings that had occurred in directing the church. And then he admitted, I have never set before any council in all the order in which a council ought to be conducted, which perhaps has deprived the council of some or many blessings. He then attempted to show the order of councils in ancient days as shown to him by a vision. The prophet's vision was of a council in Jerusalem that was presided over by the apostle Peter, which became a model for the organization of the first high council. And then in turn, it served as a model for other councils throughout the church. This was then later canonized into Doctrine and Covenants, section 102. And these basic principles are still in force and used today. Then in 1835, verses 30 through 32 were added to the minutes as they were preparing to print the Doctrine and Covenants. These verses illustrate the difference between a decision made by temporary high councils organized in remote locations and those made by the Quorum of the 12, which was then organized in 1835. So if you look at section 102, verse 2, it indicates that the high council was appointed by revelation for the purpose of settling important difficulties which might arise in the church, which could not be settled by the church or the bishop's council to the satisfaction of the parties. I looked up in the General Handbook of Instructions today, and under chapter 32, which deals with repentance and church membership councils, it indicated three purposes of church membership restriction or withdrawal. Number one, to help protect others. Number two, to help a person access the redeeming power of Jesus Christ through repentance. And number three, to protect the integrity of the church. This section goes through and dictates how the council is conducted, how they draw lots, how part of the council was to be concerned to stand up for the accused, make sure there were no insults or injustice, and how the other part of the council was to speak on behalf of the church. I love this statement by President Gordon B. Hinckley in 1990. I wish to assure you that I think there is never a judgment rendered until after prayer has been had. Action against a member is too serious a matter to result from the judgment of men alone, and particularly of one man alone. There must be the guidance of the Spirit, earnestly sought for and then followed if there is to be justice. Did a little research. The first item that the council dealt with was to hear a complaint against Brother Curtis Hodges. At the very beginning, they consider if it's an easier problem or more difficult problem, and then they appoint either 2, 4, or 6 people to speak. This one was determined to be a simpler problem, so only 2 counselors were asked to speak in defense of or on behalf of Brother Hodges, and the other one who was addressing the problem. The problem that was mentioned here, this first council meeting, was that Brother Hodges preached so loudly and so incoherently when he taught that it was almost like a shouting match. And at one point, neighbors from the local area came rushing in to see if someone was hurt or if there was this big problem. And then they said, no, it's just Brother Hodges preaching. So the result of this, after everything was said and done in the council, Brother Hodges acknowledged his error that he indicated he had not previously seen, and that he learned more from this particular council than any other time in the church, and then with the Lord's help, that he hoped to be able to successfully overcome his problem. So you can see that this council was designed, not only this council, all councils are designed to help the individuals involved. The second council was 2 days later, and the question was brought up, should disobedience to the word of wisdom, which was of course a very recent revelation, be a transgression sufficient to deprive a member from holding an office in the church? This resulted because there was a church meeting in Pennsylvania where the person who blessed the sacrament was known not to obey the word of wisdom. And as such, several members of the congregation refused to partake of the sacrament. When they looked at this, they decided this was a more severe problem. And so they had 6 counselors speak, 3 for and 3 against. The decision was that no official member of the church is worthy to hold an office after having the word of wisdom sufficiently taught them and then neglects to comply or obey them. Having participated myself in some of these types of councils, I can testify that they were some of the most sacred and religious experiences that I've ever had. The spirit of these type of councils is one of helping, not one of accusing, but one of helping people to overcome difficulties. Okay, let's move on to section 103. As we discussed last week, all of the saints that were living in Jackson County, Missouri, were driven from their homes in late 1833. Many of them crossed the river into Clay County and sought refuge there. The prophet Joseph Smith learned of these circumstances through a variety of letters that he received. And then in early 1834, Parley P. Pratt and Lyman White volunteered to travel to Kirkland to talk directly to Joseph Smith and to give him details. So this was, in fact, the 3rd meeting of the High Council there. On February the 24th, the prophet and the High Council met to hear Parley P. Pratt and Lyman White. And then they discussed how the saints might be returned to their homes in Jackson County. Parley reported that the Clay County residents, as you remember, they crossed the river into the next county, had been very sympathetic and kind to all of the displaced members. They provided work to enable the saints to feed themselves and to house themselves and provide for clothing. In particular, there was a gentleman named Michael Arthur who opened up his farm to allow more than 1,000 members of the church to live on his property and provided work for them. I believe there's also a monument near his property talking about how grateful the saints were for what he did for them. After the report was received, the prophet stood and stated that he was determined to go to Missouri and help redeem Zion. And then approximately 30 to 40 people who were present also committed to go with him to Missouri. Sometime that same day, the prophet received the revelation that is now recorded in section 103. It was seen as a continued fulfillment of the prophecy given 6 months earlier, in which the Lord indicated the prophet would lead the strength of my house unto the land of my vineyard and redeem my vineyard. If you remember, that's what we talked about last week, the parable of the redemption of Zion. In obedience to this revelation, church leaders traveled for several weeks among the congregations of the saints, gathered money, supplies, recruited people to assist in an expedition that was known as the Camp of Israel, and which we now call Zion's Camp. So if you look at section 103, in particular the first few verses, the Lord in verse 1 calls them my friends. I did listen to a podcast this week that indicated that frequently this term, my friends, was used when the Lord was addressing a group of high priests. In this revelation, he indicated that the saints were driven out of the land for 2 specific reasons. Number 1, The wicked need to be wicked so that the punishment is just when they receive it at the end. And number two, that the saints needed to be cleansed through chastisement because they were not hearkening unto the word of the Lord. They weren't listening and doing what he asked them to do. Now, this wasn't true of everyone, but it was true of a portion of the people who we find in Zion. This proves a point that sometimes all of us can be punished as a result of the wickedness of not everyone, but just a few people, or at least a portion of the people. The Lord goes on later in section 103 to indicate to them, I have decreed a decree which my people shall realize, inasmuch as they are hearkened from this very hour unto the counsel which I, the Lord, their God, shall give unto them. Behold, they shall, for I have decreed it, begin to prevail against my enemies from this very hour. In other words, the Lord was telling them that if they would just change, if they would turn to him and be obedient, he would immediately allow them to prevail. All they needed to do was to listen and obey. So historically speaking, we can look back at this and say, obviously that didn't occur. From Gordon B. Hinckley, we read the following. The world's standards generally may totter. We of the church are without excuse if we drift in the same manner. We have standards, sure, tested, and effective. To the extent that we observe them, we shall go forward. To the extent that we neglect them, we shall hinder our own progress and bring embarrassment to the work of the Lord. These standards have come from him. Some of them may appear a little out of date in our society, but this does not detract from their validity nor diminish the virtue of their application. The subtle reasoning of men, no matter how clever, no matter how plausible it may sound, cannot abide the declared wisdom of God. In Elders Quorum today, the teacher was indicating that it was very interesting to him that so many people who don't follow the words of the prophets are really in essence saying that they are more intelligent, more capable than the 15 men that lead the church that were chosen by God, and how he felt that that was very silly of them, if not in fact very arrogant. As we move further into this particular section in verse 21, it talks about how Joseph Smith is the man to whom I have likened the servant in the parable that we talked about last week, and that the purpose of Zion's camp was firstly to bring resources to the saints in Missouri, to provide relief and enable them to return to their homes and to purchase additional property. And second, as authorized by Governor Dunklin of Missouri, after the state militia had escorted the saints back to Jackson County, the members of Zion's camp would be left then to maintain order and peace. In my studies, I also discovered that there was a plan in place to create a council when they got there of 12 members, 6 members of the church and 6 people from the area around Independence that could establish the fair value of the land, and that the saints would offer to purchase all of the land in that surrounding area for anybody who did not wish to remain. In other words, they would buy the land from the people who had thrown them out in an effort to make peace. Verse 27 is very interesting, where the Lord said, let no man be afraid to lay down his life for my sake, for whoso layeth down his life for my sake shall find it. Interestingly enough, a young man who went on Zion's camp was Wilford Woodruff. I say young man, but he was in his 20s. I guess compared to me, he was young. Wilford was warned by his neighbors that he would lose his life if he went with the prophet Joseph to Missouri. I guess there were a lot of saints that were sitting on the fence. They wanted to see, they were testing the Lord to see if he would redeem Zion. If he did redeem Zion, then they would be all in. So that would be the miracle that they needed. When they told Wilford that he would be killed if he went, he replied that if a ball should pierce his heart while in Missouri, that it would have been time well spent, and that he would have been doing what he thought was necessary for the Lord. From President Faust, we have, for most of us, what is required is not to die for the church, but to live for it. For many, living a Christ-like life every day may be even more difficult than laying down one's life. Sometimes it's easier to make a dramatic gesture, and one flash in the pan is often easier than the day-to-day grinding out of living a good life. Verse 31 is interesting. It says, behold, this is my will. Ask and you shall receive, but men do not always do my will. At the end of the High Council meeting in which the church leaders discussed the situation of what was happening in Missouri, Joseph indicated he would go to Zion, and approximately 30 or 40 people volunteered to go with him. Then the Lord assigned 8 men to go throughout the congregations of the church to recruit volunteers and to seek contributions for provisions and money that they would need for the saints in Missouri. Originally, he asked for 500 and then 300, but only 200 people actually went to Zion's camp, including some women and children. It was around 220. Okay, let's consider Doctrine and Covenants section 104. In the spring of 1834, the church was having financial difficulties, and their efforts to collect money for relief of the saints in Missouri had failed. In March of 1832, the church in Ohio had established an organization called the United Firm to manage the church's commercial, mercantile, and business interests in a way that would help Zion and then also care for the poor. In April 1832, they also met with leaders in the church in Missouri and organized a branch of the United Firm in Jackson County. These 2 branches, one in Ohio and one in Missouri, continued for 2 years. Now, sometimes you'll hear it called the United Firm, and sometimes you'll hear it called the United Order. And this was done to hide the financial nature of what they were attempting to do from the enemies of the church. So this financial group, this corporate management, took care of their mercantile stores, the printing offices, and any church land or businesses. Because of mob violence that occurred the year before in Missouri, the printing office and the store in Missouri were basically ransacked or destroyed. Now, these were heavily depended on by the church to produce income. They still had to repay the debts that had been acquired to establish and supply these businesses. So as their indebtedness continued to increase, they borrowed money to supply the Kirkland storehouse and to purchase additional land and a new printing press. This section also indicated that some of the firm's members manifested a covetous spirit towards the firm's property for which they were responsible. Because of these difficulties, the members of the Kirkland branch of the United Firm met in April of 1834 and decided that the firm should be dissolved and that each one should receive a stewardship or individual property to oversee and manage. About 2 weeks later, the prophet Joseph received the revelation recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 104, which contained further instructions for the Lord regarding the United Firm and what they should do. Just want to make a side note here. This is the Kirkland ashery. Most of us don't understand what an ashery is. This is the inside of the ashery. The frontier settlers brought wood to this ashery for either money or credit. They used the wood to heat huge cauldrons of water that were alkalinized by running it through wood ashes gathered from the farmers' fields and from their own operation. The remains after the water boiled away made potash, which was used in making glass and cleaning wool and in other industrial processes. Newell K. Whitney then shipped most of these chemicals in large barrels to factories in the East or to Great Britain. This was one of the best money-making enterprises that the church owned. In verse 4 here, you can see that inasmuch as some of my servants have not kept the commandment, but have broken the covenant through covetousness and with feigned words, I have cursed them with a very sore and grievous curse. Elder Joseph B. Worthlin of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles warned against the dangers of covetousness. Brothers and sisters, beware of covetousness. It is one of the great afflictions of these latter days. It creates greed and resentment. Often it leads to bondage, heartbreak, and crushing, grinding debt. You can see that even after 200 years, we're still dealing with some of the same problems. Later in this section, in particular in verse 13, the Lord deals with accountability, stewardship, and of building the kingdom. Remember, and I think we often forget this, everything that we have is a stewardship from the Lord. And whose kingdom are we actually building? In verse 16, we learn, but it must needs be done in my own way. Those familiar with Mandalorian, behold, this is the way that I, the Lord, have decreed to provide for my saints, that the poor shall be exalted, and that the rich are made low. And then in verse 17, for the earth is full, and there is enough and to spare. Yea, I prepare all things, and have given unto the children of men to be agents unto themselves. From Brother Worthlin again, the Lord's way consists of helping people help themselves. The poor are exalted because they work for the temporary assistance they receive. They are taught correct principles, and they are able to lift themselves from poverty to self-reliance. The rich are made low because they humble themselves to give generously of their means to those in need. Okay, moving on to section 105. Just as a side note, this was not included in the original 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. It was included in the 1844 edition. In February 34, the prophet declared his intention to lead an expedition to Missouri. In the revelation recorded previously in 103, the Lord instructed the prophet and 7 other men to travel to outlying branches of the church to recruit volunteers. Although the Lord had asked them to try to recruit 500, the most they were able to recruit was a little more than 200. And they were accompanied by 12 women and 10 children. Members of the expedition organized by the prophet made preparations to go to Missouri to assist the state militia. The men in the expedition would remain as a protective force. In early May, the prophet Joseph departed with around 100 men from Ohio. This group was referred to the Camp of Israel, later became known as Zion's Camp. The group traveled approximately 900 miles through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. They were joined by additional men who were recruited by Hiram Smith and Lyman White in the Michigan Territory, and others who joined them on the way west. As Zion's Camp traveled through northern Missouri, tensions grew in Jackson County as word was spread that the Mormon army was approaching. The prophet sent Parley P. Pratt and Orson Hyde to Missouri state capital in Jefferson City to request the military assistance of the governor, who had promised to help the saints reclaim their lands. However, the governor was reluctant to get involved in the matter. I guess we shouldn't think badly of him. He, I think, was trying to avoid bloodshed. He could see the writing on the wall. The research that I did showed that he knew the fanatical nature of some of the people in Missouri and that they would go to the wall to fight against having the saints be returned to their land. And so in order to avoid kind of a mini civil war in Missouri, he made the decision to not assist the saints. So this meant that without the needed protection, they would not be able to regain their homes. After receiving the news that they would not receive assistance from Governor Dunklin, the members of Zion's Camp proceeded toward the saints who were sheltered in Clay County, and they camped approximately 10 miles northeast of Liberty, Missouri, between 2 forks of the Fishing River. On June 19th, 5 armed men approached the camp and threatened that approximately 400 men were planning to attack the camp. However, the members of Zion's Camp were protected when a thunderstorm rolled in to the area, in which the saints took refuge in a local Baptist church. While this tremendous thunderstorm came, it was a very clear day, and it started off as a little black cloud in the distance, then quickly rolled in and became a very fierce storm that overturned everything, that sent hail down, that broke branches, that caused the Missouri army of discontented people to run for shelter. And it broke up this whole idea that there would be a battle. And Joseph Smith was said to have remarked that God was in this storm. Afterwards, the next day, Joseph Smith met with a colonel from the militia who said, "I see that the Lord's hand is here protecting this people." Members of Zion's Camp viewed the storm as evidence that God was protecting them. One member of the camp, Nathan Baldwin, stated, "The Lord had previously said he would fight the battles of his saints, and it seemed as though the mandate had gone from his presence to ply the artillery of heaven in defense of his servants." In an effort to calm the Missouri citizens, the prophet Joseph Smith and some others in the camp signed a statement on June 21st, indicating they did not intend to commence hostilities, but sought for a peaceful way for the saints to return. The following day, on the 22nd, the prophet held a council to discuss how the camp should proceed. And during that meeting, he received the revelation that we now have as Doctrine and Covenants, section 105, which revealed that the church was no longer required to redeem the land of Zion at that time. As members of the camp learned that they would not be required to fight, some accepted it as the will of the Lord, but others were upset and murmured and even apostatized from the church. As you read section 105, the Lord explains a couple of reasons about why the redemption of Zion was no longer necessary. In verse 2, we find that if it were not for the transgressions of my people, speaking concerning the church and not individuals, they might have been redeemed even now. But behold, they have not learned to be obedient to the things which I required at their hands, but are full of all manner of evil, and do not impart of their substance, as becometh saints, to the poor and afflicted among them. They are not united according to the union required by the law of the celestial kingdom. And Zion cannot be built up unless it is by the principles of the law of the celestial kingdom. So the reason number one was they were not a Zion people. Zion could not be redeemed, could not be established as the Lord had originally intended, because they were not a Zion people. They had not learned to impart freely of their substance with each other. Later in the section, he gives us reason number two. Behold, I have commanded my servant Joseph Smith Jr. to say unto the strength of my house, even my warriors, my young men and middle age, to gather together for the redemption of my people, and throw down the towers of my enemies, and scatter their watchmen. But the strength of mine house have not hearkened unto my words. Remember, in the parable, they were supposed to redeem Zion, and that the Lord had requested 500 people, but only a little more than 200 people came. Zion blessings need Zion's people, but the people weren't there yet. And so the Lord delayed the redemption of Zion. But the strength of mine house have not hearkened unto my words. But inasmuch as there are those who have hearkened unto my words, the 200 plus people that went, I have prepared a blessing and an endowment from them if they continue faithful. Because Zion's camp never restored the saints to their lands, many people felt that the endeavor was a failure. However, if you look at the people who actually participated, there's a bit of a different story from their testimonies. This is a testimony from Brigham Young. When we arrived in Missouri, the Lord spoke to his servant Joseph and said, I've accepted your offering, and we had the privilege to return again. On my return, many friends asked me what profit there was in calling men from their labor to go up to Missouri and then return without apparently accomplishing anything. Who has it benefited, asked they, if the Lord did command it to be done? What object did he have in view in doing so? I told those brethren that I was well paid with heavy interest, yea, that my measure was filled to overflowing with the knowledge that I had received by traveling with the prophet. From Wilford Woodruff, I was in Zion's camp with the prophet of God. I saw the dealings of God with him. I saw the power of God with him. I saw that he was a prophet. What was manifest to him by the power of God upon that mission was of great value to me and to all who received his instructions. When the members of Zion's camp were called, many of us had never beheld each other's faces. We were strangers to each other, and many had never seen the prophet. We had been scattered abroad like corn sifted in a sieve throughout the nation. We were young men, and we were called upon in that early day to go up and redeem Zion. And what we had to do by faith. We assembled together from the various states at Kirkland and went up to redeem Zion, in fulfillment of the commandment of God unto us. God accepted our works as he did the works of Abraham. We accomplished a great deal. Though apostates and unbelievers may many times ask the question, what have you done? We gained an experience that we never could have gained in any other way. We had the privilege of beholding the face of the prophet. We had the privilege of traveling 1,000 miles with him and seeing the workings of the Spirit of God with him and the revelations of Jesus Christ unto him and the fulfillment of those revelations. And he gathered some 200 elders from throughout the nation in that early day and sent us broadcast into the world to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Had I not gone with the Zion's camp, I should not be here today. By going there, we were thrust into the vineyard to preach the gospel, and the Lord accepted our labors. In all our labors and persecution, with our lives often at stake, we have had to work and live by faith. The experience we obtained in traveling in Zion's camp was of more worth than gold. This reminds me of the story of the Martin Handcart Company, who were trapped as they left too late in the season to arrive in the Salt Lake Valley. A lot of people questioned what happened there, but when you read the journals of the people who actually were there, they said it dramatically changed their lives. Near the end of section 105, you read these two verses, which are kind of foreshadowing something. There has been a day of calling, but the time has come for a day of choosing, and let those be chosen that are worthy. And it shall be manifest unto my servant by the voice of the Spirit, those that are chosen, and they shall be sanctified. Elder Oakes indicated that most of the leaders of the church for the next 50 years came to know Joseph Smith and received their formative training on the march of Zion's camp. From the Church History and Fullness of Times, we read the following. The prophet later explained, God did not want you to fight. He would not organize his kingdom with 12 men to open the doors of the gospel to the nations of the earth and with 70 men under their direction to follow in their tracks, unless he took them from a body of men who had offered their lives and who had made as great a sacrifice as did Abraham. In February 1835, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and the first Quorum of the 70 were organized. 9 of the original 12 apostles, all 7 presidents of the Quorum of the 70, and all 63 other members of that quorum had served in the army of Israel that marched to Western Missouri in 1834. It's kind of interesting because, as it said there, February 1835, it was actually February the 14th, Valentine's Day. Joseph Smith called for all the people who had participated in science camp to come to a meeting. Of course, there were many other people that were there, and he separated the people from who had attended science camp and the rest of the people. And then he called for the 3 witnesses. He said to them, now is the time to fulfill your assignment to call the 12 apostles. And they did. And so you can see that 9 of the 12 apostles actually were on science camp, and the whole quorum of the 70 came from the brethren who were on science camp. Well, I hope that that little history tour has helped you as you read through your assignment this week. Thanks for watching. Have a great week.